Anything about singlet or the literary scene, or even like maybe some of you are thinking of writing a book or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So like in school, right? Like the way that we learn literature, like just now Rachel was talking about how it's very like you have to look into this symbol, then you analyze it, and then like specifically for poetry, there's some format that we usually have to follow. Like there's this thing called SMILE. So it goes like simile, metaphor, and then some other imagery, something. Yeah. So like what are your thoughts on this way of learning about poetry?
I suppose because you guys are thinking of poetry as having some basic elements, right? Like most poems would consist of similes or metaphors and so on. I have no problem with trying to make use of a framework to help in the understanding of a poem, and you're basically making the things a little bit easier by breaking the poem into different parts to examine. So I don't see it as a problem. Yeah. The only time that you might encounter some issues would be if, let's say, a poem is very experimental and it doesn't quite follow this particular framework, or it is a poem that is intentional in its usage of cliches, then if that's the case, if you were to make a criticism based on the usage of cliche, then you might be a little bit off, right? Because if the poet's intention is to be satirical about a certain situation and play up the usage of cliches, then you might be missing the point. If you say that, oh, this poem is not so good because it's got too much, too many words or lines that are ridden with cliches. Yeah.
Yeah, like I guess it's only a problem if it's like too rigid. Like when you look at a poem, then this is the only thing that you think about.
Yeah, but if you use a framework with an idea that, oh, like things could actually be kind of moved around, or it could consist of other things, then the framework is just a guide, right?
Yeah.
It's not a fixed set of rules and regulations that you must die kind of like follow. Then that's probably okay.
Yeah.
But do you think students would like tend to fall back on this a bit too much and like neglect from experiencing the poem as it is? Like for example, when you read a poem, you probably see like like for example, this person, I like the usage
Emotional
of this,
impact.
as a child, but however, like because of the framework.
It depends on how your teachers are kind of advocating the usage, right? Is the rubrics based on this framework
I would say it's more drilled into us.
or drilled into you?
Yeah, like
Okay.
remember smile.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose in a context of, let's say, education, and if you are doing this as part of schoolwork, if I were you, I would probably do the smart thing of trying to follow the set rules and regulations, because you don't really know for sure if you were to deviate from this framework, whether you'll be penalized for it. And I'm saying it in a very practical way. And also the fact that the intention is probably good, because by providing a framework, it helps you to understand a topic like poetry in a more concrete way. Otherwise, it is just something that is formless and it's so abstract that it's hard to have a grip on it. Yeah. It's just like when I'm teaching creative writing, I talked about fiction in terms of having a main character with a quest and having obstacles that oppose this one quest. And I will use it as a framework by specifying that in a story there's always just one main character, and in a story there's only one quest. And that is a framework to make it easy for students to understand the concepts of the story. It doesn't mean that in the real world there are no exceptions to the rule, but in order to help the student to understand story concepts, by providing the most basic model as a framework, then that's how they can learn. And then when they start learning how to write, they will also be able to write by not tackling on too much, right? By coming up with something that's too, let's say, experimental or multiple threads of narration or whatever, then they just focus on one character with one quest and multiple obstacles. Just like how your teachers might be making use of framework to help you with learning poetry.
So it's like a base.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that after you have learned this and you have applied it well in your assignments and all that, and you've gotten a good grade out of this, that moving beyond it, you cannot think beyond this framework, right? Because beyond that, then it's up to you how you are gonna still make use of this framework, or in future when you're reading a poetry book, there's already no longer this need to follow this framework. You might only be adopting things that are useful, right? And you will be able to discern that, in this case, maybe part of this SMILE framework can still be used, but there are also other things that I now realize. And that's up to you to kind of deconstruct or to add on to a particular framework and form your own way of understanding a particular poem or future poems that you'll be reading. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Any questions? Yeah.
Actually, how do you think this education system, like this sort of framework that we have, affects like how people view poetry once they grow out of this education system? Because like in Singapore, the literary scene is still developing, and there's still quite little people who actually are really truly interested in poetry. So like, how do you think like literature students in school, like using this framework, kind of like?
Are you saying that using this framework kind of stifle your interest?
I think sometimes, because like for different poems, you kind of have to look at it differently. And if you always just stick to this certain framework, then there are some limitations to how much you can appreciate.
But even if you look at similes and metaphors, different poems do make use of similes and metaphors differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the framework only specify at a very high level what are some of the major components of poetry. It doesn't mean that, I don't think it's suggesting that all the poems are the same, just because I'm making use of the same framework to apply to all the poems. Yeah, like for example, if I were to teach poetry, I would probably still tell the students that, if you look at poetry, one thing that makes a poem is the fact that there seems to be more usage of similes and metaphors, right? And there's also an ear to how the poem sound like in terms of the flow and the rhythm, and then also in terms of the line breaks, how does a poem look like on the page. So I don't know whether things like that I would tell my participants of a creative writing workshop, would that be kind of similar to the kind of framework that you are using? But like I said, a framework is just a framework. A framework can possibly be used to kind of apply to different poems across the spectrum. There might be a few poems that might be a bit difficult to fit into the framework. Then in which case, you would then have to explain why there's not such a nice fit, right? So once again, because I've not made use of this particular framework, and I've also not done like teaching and marking at the secondary school level, so I can't tell for sure how much the marking is governed by the framework or the rubric. In my teaching experience at Republic Poly, for example, when we analyze a particular story, there is always a kind of a sense of a model answer, right? Like, based on this story, who is the main character? But if the student felt that the main character is somebody else, and this person is able to explain very well and justify the answers, it doesn't mean that this person will get 0 marks, right? So, likewise, I'm hoping that despite the fact that a framework is being advocated in your learning of how to criticize or to analyze a poem, I'm hoping that the framework is used as a set of guidelines. But if you were to deviate from the framework, and if you are still able to provide certain opinions that make sense, and you are able to justify what you are writing, I don't think that you should be penalized for it. Yeah, right. I mean, unless the question is asking you specifically about simile and metaphor, and you talk about something else, and obviously then it wouldn't match the answer for what it's asking for.
I think we were like mainly concerned about like use in like the Singaporean literature scene. So actually I have like another question somehow related to that. But actually I think me and our teacher were like talking about this like before you came, but it was basically about like singlet and like on social media, for example, because like personally, like someone actually did label my poetry singlet before, so I was like thinking, what is a model singlet poem, or like what would people think of singlet? Like, how would people think of singlet? Like, what do you mean? What defines a singlet for you? Yes, that was exactly what should I say?
I don't think there is a very clear answer on what is singlet, right? It's just like asking, what is American poetry? So if you try to harp on the technical aspect of that particular question, then you probably would say that, anybody who is either a Singapore citizen or Singapore PR, so whatever they write would be considered as singlet, right? In terms of creative writing that they do. And if you define literature as poetry, fiction, or creative non-fiction, then all this type of genres would fall under this definition of literature. So you have got Singapore literature, and that's how you would define this particular term. But then what about people who are based in Singapore, but they are foreigners, right? Then would you consider that as Singapore literature? Especially if this person is writing a lot about the Singapore experience.
Actually, my question was more about like, for example, because sometimes we look at like American drama, or like Korean drama, so like we tend to write about that kind of subject matter. So do we still consider that singlet? Like, because it doesn't really touch on the Singaporean experience or like anything we see in our real life. It's more like because we think about like, how would the American high school life be like? Then we write a poem about it, but we're Singaporean.
Oh,
so it's more like globalization.
To me, I don't feel that this term Singapore literature has to touch on writing that is set in a particular local environment, or it has to touch on a particular very localized type of topic.
Okay.
You get me? Because if let's say if I were to write a poem about how much I enjoy Korean drama, but the very fact that you are writing as a Singaporean would make that piece of writing singlet, right?
Oh, but some of the writing I see online, for example, or even I write, like I don't write in the perspective of a Singaporean. Like I write as like another entity.
Oh, yeah. But then, but you see, let's say an American director, right? Let's say Steven Spielberg. He finds that there's a particular book that's written by a Singapore writer to be very interesting, and he decides to adapt it into a film, right? So this particular film is, let's say, set in Singapore, but when you watch this particular film, and because it's directed by Steven Spielberg, you will still say that this is an American film, right?
Because if Steven Spielberg actually did, like, for example, his interpretation of the Singaporean culture.
Yeah.
And because, film to book adaptations are like slightly different, right? So like, for example, if he had people drinking Coke or something, and people don't actually drink Coke in Singapore, like we drink kopi O or something, yeah. So then maybe we'll call it American film, because that's the American interpretation of the Singapore experience.
Yeah.
Whereas like, when I think about like poetry, like for example, if I write about like I'm in a cold dark room, and then I'm looking at letters and everything, so that doesn't really tie anything to like the Singaporean experience, or like it doesn't even show that I'm remotely Singaporean if I don't tell you my name or where I'm from.
Okay.
So it doesn't really have a strong Singaporean identity to it. So
Okay,
like,
if you ask me personally, I still feel that that would be
Singlet?
considered singlet
Okay.
because the singlet is tied to who is the one who's writing it.
Okay.
You get what I mean?
Then would you say it's like a little bit lost because on Instagram we are all anonymous? Yeah, actually, I think some of us have poetry accounts and have.
Oh,
and
so
have
you're saying that you write anonymously, is it?
Yes, and we don't share much about ourselves. Like for example, I think our generation when we write poetry, we just put out the word over there. We don't tell you, oh, I'm XXX from Singapore.
Then of course nobody would be able to have any evidence to say that this is singlet, right?
Oh, but yet somehow like sometimes people will label you like, oh, I feel the singlet energy coming out from this piece. Like I don't know why, but it's like
No,
this
but
unspeakable
then
thing.
the question is not so much in terms of the definition of what singlet is.
Maybe it's not.
It's basically bring out another interesting fact that no matter how much you hide, right, your identity, the way you write, even though you're writing about foreign subjects, there's still a very strong Singaporean sensibility that is still coming through.
Yeah.
That's why people can tell that, oh, this person could possibly be a
Singaporean.
Singaporean.
Yeah, because honestly, I feel like the social media has made like the poetry writing like so much more accessible and everything, and you meet people writing in different styles from all across the
Yeah.
world, like different mother tongues and everything, and somehow Singaporean writing is like somehow a little bit recognizable to us. I'm not sure whether you've noticed it.
Okay, I'm not an expert in like going through all this social media type of poems and be able to identify why this is more Singaporean than the other. But I suppose this is a very subjective thing, right?
Yes.
I don't know how that other person is able to tell, right? Maybe you should ask that person, and that person might be able to explain to you, oh, it's because of the way that you phrase it that sounded a little bit like how a Singaporean would speak, or maybe there's some kind of an Singlish type of inflection in the how the words are being put together, or maybe there's just some references that normally an American person would not use. And if you have done some studies overseas and all that, you might also know that the Americans are very stuck in a particular worldview that is of their own. If you deviate from that, then they won't understand you. Like if you say that, oh, I need a lift from you, they won't understand. But if you say, I need a ride from you, then they can understand.
Actually, I did ask that person because I was curious, and they said it was because of the excessive use of mother tongue. Yeah, because like Singapore we're well known for being like a melting pot. Most of us aren't like our parents are immigrants, our grandparents are immigrants. So we have that strong tie to our either ancestral homeland. Like for example, I think she said that her family was in Malaysia and China. Yeah, so I think cause like we try to infuse these elements into like our poetry, which makes it like kind of Singlish.
So you use Chinese words?
Yes.
Okay. But then they could also say that you might be from Hong Kong or China, right? Or
but
Taiwan?
I'm not sure whether like, people even pick up from it, because I think this has happened to me like many times. But then whenever they see Chinese words with English words, then they're like, it's Singlet.
It's Singlet.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure about the connection.
Then maybe it's just lucky
maybe.
guess on their part.
But
Unless you're using certain terms that in Chinese, a mainland Chinese would not use. Like if you say 冷气, right? Like air conditioning. In China, they will say 空调, right?
I'm quite sure it was 名言警句, but yeah, like the 一朝被蛇咬.
You mean like just a normal Chinese,
yes,
is
that
it?
kind of,
Which means that it could also be claimed by people
Yes,
from
it
China and all
definitely
that.
could, but I think Singapore, That's why it just got me thinking whether Singaporean poets like tend to have this certain flavor.
Or maybe they just felt like, oh, your English standard is very high, so could not be from China.
There's also the other way,
I don't
other way
know.
to look like it.
Yeah,
look
I,
at
I
it.
can't,
Yeah.
I can't tell from that other person's perspective how they.
I'm just curious, honestly,
Yeah.
like about
But
how.
honestly, nowadays for Singapore poets, when we are writing, we are just writing. We don't really think like, oh, does this fit into the definition of singlet, or does this come across as very Singaporean in terms of sensibility? I suppose when people read through this book that I have written, they will probably say that, oh yeah, it's very Singaporean because there are references
Subject
here and
matter,
there, right?
yeah.
And subject matter. So, on the other hand, if a poet like Cyril Wong is writing about emotions or relationship with the father, then it's very universal, right? And
Yeah.
why does it make it feel more Singaporean than universal? Then it's a very subtle thing.
The culture, I guess.
Yeah, so it's a very subtle thing. And I don't feel like I have enough of that experience in reading all this subtle nuances and all that to be able to tell you exactly how these people have done it, like in exposing you as a Singaporean writer when you were trying to maybe not explicitly mention that you are from Singapore. So it's perhaps it's worthwhile of a thesis or something. I don't know. Maybe next time when you all have graduated and moving on to university, that's maybe a thesis that you want to do a research on.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be interesting, right? What makes a piece of writing Singaporean? And you've gone through all these examples on social media, and you probably have to do some sort of a survey or a sample size of all these different writing and figure out what
What's the
makes them.
commonality?
Yeah, what's the common? Maybe one more question.
You know how like on social media, right? There's like other than stuff that Rachel might post, because she posts like usually longer stuff.
Yeah.
There's also this rising trend of like very short poetry,
Oh,
like
you
very
mean like
simple.
Instagram poetry.
Yeah, like that kind that it's more of like a few lines. Wait, let me get
Are
an
you talking
example.
about like Ruby Call?
Yeah, that kind of poetry. So like, what are your thoughts on
Oh,
it?
okay.
Yeah.
I really think that it sometimes is just a matter of branding. Like, I used to really get into like beat poetry, like people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and all that. And at that point, what they were writing seems to be much more casual compared to poets who are very conscious about structure of their poems and all that. So even at that time, they are probably asking like, is beat poetry by this group of people called the Beat Generation considered as poetry or not? Because they sounded quite like prose with line breaks, and would that qualify as poetry, right? So likewise, the same questions are being asked now, right? Like would Ruby Kaur or Liang Leaf type of poems, what we call the Insta poem, right? Would they be considered poetry? I would say that yes, they can be considered poetry, but whether is it good poetry or bad poetry, is it something that's memorable or not memorable, then obviously the views might be divided, right?
Yeah, I think so.
The fact that some of you might be fans of those works, or it affects people in a certain way, it does mean that they do have a certain group of readers who follow their works.
Yeah.
And in fact, they probably outsell a lot of
Yeah.
veteran published poets, right? Even poet laureates from various countries or Pulitzer Prize winners and all that. So why is it so? So whatever they have written must have some sort of resonance, right?
Yeah.
So to me, I feel like yes, they can be considered poetry. Can it be better? Are they pushing themselves hard enough to write better? Then obviously it's always something that they can continuously striving for to improve their craft, right? But the fact that they are able to connect with people also means that the very loose way of writing, the very prose-like way of writing, might also be the strengths of how they have written. Yeah. Personally, I do feel like if I were them, I would actually be thinking of ways to improve, right? Like maybe at this stage of my life when I start off, I might be writing in this way that's very casual and loose. But is there any way that I could add certain layers of complexity or ambiguity to it? Then it might be a way for me to evolve if I'm part of this Insta poets movement, right?
Yeah.
But it's really a very subjective thing. So it's not a matter of whether they are doing the right thing or the wrong thing, but whether there is a market for such type of poetry, and would they want to change the style of writing to so-called improve themselves? But who are they trying to please, right? Because there is a certain group of people who are basically setting the standards, and these are the people who are able to analyze and critique poems, just like what you guys are doing. So whether it fits a particular taste or style, and taste and all that can also change over the years. So maybe in a few years' time, when people look back, maybe they're ahead of their times. So I'm not sure. So I mean, I always go back to this idea of beat poetry, and thinking about how beat poetry, maybe at that point in time, they were too advanced, and they don't always get the total acceptance from everyone in the scene. But then after that certain period of time, when you look back, then maybe there's something there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
One last question.
Yes, go.
Okay, do you have like a piece of advice for people who are aspiring to like write in Singapore?
In Singapore, okay. Are you interested more in terms of exploring poetry or fiction?
Poetry.
Poetry, okay. I think that if you are planning to write poetry, it's good to be with people who are also interested in writing poetry. So let's say your friends are writing poetry, and you can share your poems with one another, then I think that's also one way of kind of keeping each other like on their toes, and making sure that you all can improve together, right? And sometimes it can also be a bit more fun in a sense of having fellow writers that you are trying to kind of compete in a friendly way with one another. But of course, moving beyond friends, then obviously it's also in terms of how you would get out into the scene and to meet more people. So whether you are attending book launches or attending events at the Singapore Writers Festival and trying to attend workshops here and there, organized by international poets, and trying to learn more, then I think that's part of the process of becoming a better writer. Of course, everyone's purpose is to get published, right? So I think it's something that you can work towards. And along the way, you can also think about submitting to journals or anthologies. And if you get acceptance in some of these smaller projects, then I think it gives you the confidence to aim for publication of a chapbook, which is maybe about 20 poems, or a full-fledged collection, which is 40 or 50 poems. Yeah. So it really is how you want to do it. But it doesn't mean that you have to put the rest of your life on hold, because you are just doing this as your hobby. And I don't think there's a problem treating poetry as a kind of a hobby that you are able to do outside of your work or your schooling, right? And you also need to have those other experiences to draw inspirations from. So your poems can also be a reflection of the kind of maybe pressures or problems or joys that you encounter in your studies or your life in general. And without those real life experiences doing other things, you may not have the inspiration for your poetry. So in that sense, even if your attempts at trying to be a poet doesn't quite lead to anything, but at least you derive the joy from it, right? And on the other hand, in a very practical Singaporean way, you're not putting the rest of your life on hold, just banging on the fact that, oh, I'm going to be a poet and I'm just going to be writing poetry and teaching poetry. But if this thing doesn't pan out, there's always this other track that you can fall on, which can then become your career, which will then continue to inspire you for future poems, which might mean that success is still down the road, right? So that's how I would view it. It's not a matter of like, oh, I want to be a poet, therefore I must leave everything behind. I go and live on the mountain top and just be a poet, right? So I think that's also putting a lot of eggs in one basket.
Yep.
And if it doesn't happen, then how? Because then your whole life is just about poetry, right? I mean, imagine if at the end of it you find that, oh, actually my calling is not in poetry, then I think it will be such a shock to the system, right? Because there's nothing else left really. That can be quite scary. But if you think of it this way of concentrating on different things, and I think people can multitask, right? So if you're concentrating on other things and you're also enjoying life, experiencing what life has to offer while studying in another area that enrich you in another way, then I think that is not just a backup plan. That is also a way to continuously remind you that you are living this life, and that fits into your writing as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.